What's going on YouTube? This is Luca, the co-host of the Movie Pope podcast, and today we are taking a look at our interviews with Margaret Edwartowski, a writer and comedian based out of Detroit, Michigan. We'll be chatting with her about her time with Second City, and we'll also be chatting with her about her novel that she released back in November of 2024. She was a really great joy to have on the show, and plan on having her come back pretty soon. But for the time being, sit back, relax, and enjoy our two interviews with Margaret Edwartowski here on the Movie Pope podcast. And welcome back to the Movie Pope podcast. And today we have another great guest here. We've got Margaret Edwartowski here from Detroit, and she is going to regale us with tales of improv. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and be sure to share this video with everyone that you know. And as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and let's go ahead and dive in. Margaret, how are you doing this fine Saturday, the 17th?
17th. I'm doing well,
I'm getting old here.
That's okay. I had to look at my computer's, calendar too, so I get it. I'm doing well, thank you.
So Margaret, when initially when we chatted, this was like way back in August or like last summer, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
I could easily look at my email, but I'm also lazy as I get older. But but I originally found you guys when I was looking for guests from the from the film festival scene, and at that time I sent an email to the Detroit Can Film Festival, and you responded, and I initially thought that it was you who was behind all of that, but then you introduced me to Nick, and we had a very wonderful interview, and I'll have a link to that down in the description below. But during that interview, he was telling me about how you were a big name, in Detroit, especially in the Detroit improv scene, and that perked my ears up. I'm like, oh, good Lord, I need to get her on my show now. I've been chatting with her, and I had no idea. So here we are. So, Margaret, let's just go ahead and kick things off. Tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and how you ended up, doing improv and running the Detroit Can Film Festival, or getting involved in the film festival scene, I should say.
Sure. Maybe I'll work from today backward rather than start from the beginning. You never know, writing a bio, like, do I start from the beginning or the end? So currently I'm the executive director for Y Arts, which is the arts and humanities branch of the YMCA of Metropolitan Detroit, which basically means we keep on a stable of about 20 teaching artists in theater, media arts, and visual arts. And then we do programming in YMCA branches, in schools, wherever in the community that can be. And we also have a theater and a gallery. So I'm very blessed to have a day job that is not only in the arts, but also that serves the community, so it's really fulfilling, and I get to work with youth, but also I get to make opportunities for artists. So so a lot of my focus is about making the Metro Detroit creative community, as contributing to it being as robust as possible, both in like developing young people's creativity and also keeping artists in the area. So through that work and through some mutual friends, I know a guy named Tommy Simon, who is a fellow improviser, who is friends with Nick, and Nick and I have a lot of mutual friends. Actually, it's a small town in a lot of ways, creative town.
Right.
So I got to meet Nick, who is an absolutely fascinating and wonderful character, and I'm so glad he came into my life. But he had this idea of a film festival for young people to tell stories in initially 10-second films,
Right.
and we would pick this socially relevant topic, and then do that, and then we give away cash prizes and scholarships and stuff, and it's an amazing program. So that's kind of how we connected, and I have the opportunity, and we host that at the theater at the Y, and I do a lot of the trying to get young people to do that, but it ties in with this youth media program we run out of the Y called Y Media Works, which is for middle and high school youth. Used to be more of a filmmaking oriented program, but then once equipment became so accessible, and more affordable equipment could do more, then we were able to, instead of worrying about doing sustainability with funding for equipment, we were able to focus on content. Okay, I'm getting way off track on the bio. So before the Y, I was an actor, a playwright, and a teacher. I got a theater degree from Wayne State University and then in Detroit, and then I was with the Second City Comedy Theater. They had one here in Detroit, so I was with that for probably about 10 plus years, more 20. And then I started an improv company at the Planet Ant Theater in Hamtramck. So I've been sort of the, like, I don't want to say it, like the emeritus, you know, a lot of my friends left town, so I became the grandma of improv in Detroit. But you know, my friend Nancy Hayden and I have a 2-woman troupe called Bottle of Red, and so we're sort of the veterans in town, and are kind of involved that way. So yeah, so that's kind of my general creativity, and now I'm doing a lot of fiction writing. Predominantly in romance novels, so that's a whole other world.
Oh, okay, romance. Yeah. So is it sort of like those old school? What's his name, Fabian or Fabiano?
Oh, Fabio.
Fabio.
You know, funnily enough, even though the books are still as spicy as they once were, nowadays the trend is to have illustrated covers. I think because women of today still want the same content without the same obvious wrapper. So
it's not, I mean, as a guy, right, and as someone who was familiar with seeing those with those generic romance novels from the 1990s, I always thought that they were pretty much all the same. It's like this fantastical scene set in a faraway land in a distant time where the lady is always wearing a corset and they are besotted with this roguish man with flowing blonde hair who's like, "My lady, I've come to serve you." And yes. It's just like, and they just swoon because for whatever reason they find accents so sexy.
Yes.
Speaking of which, I'm about to get off topic here, but I just feel like
I already did that like 4 times, so I think
you set the precedent. So I remember back in elementary school, we had to go. We went to this camp in South Carolina called Camp Thunderbird, and there was one of the camp counselors. His name was Marcel, and he was from the UK. And can you believe it? All these 12 and 13-year-old girls were all of a sudden just crowding around. I'm like, oh my God, Marcel, and they're just and as you can imagine, they're all asking him to like just say certain words. Can you say this or can you say that? And he would say, and all the girls would just like start clapping. All the guys, you can imagine, all the guys would just stand like, whatever, like this jerk here, yeah, whatever. and for whatever reason, whenever he said Adidas, he said Adidas, right? That's how they say it in the UK. Whenever he said Adidas, the girl, like, I swear to God, it was like feeding time at the zoo. It's like all of a sudden, like the whole camp would just burst out into like this giddy giggle and clapping, and all the guys would just be like, "Yep, he said Adidas. Yep,
aluminium." Yeah, I had when I first got in the touring company in Second City of Detroit, there was a fella in the company who was from Ipswich, and he was a really funny guy, and we had a running gig. So we're in the touring company, so we had a lot of time to kill in the van. So one of our running bits we constantly did was like, I was American girl, whoever, and he was British guy who was really kind of just a jerk, but no matter what he did, I would swoon because he had the accent. So like he could treat me like utter garbage, and I'd be like, I know, so I'm free later. It didn't matter what he said.
Well, what's funny is that to us, right? Whenever we hear an English accent, doesn't matter where it's from. We, well, I should say American women anyway. Us guys couldn't give two shits. They kind of just get excited and giddy. Whereas in the UK, if you speak with someone from the UK, they're like, "Oh yeah, if you're from this part of the country, we kind of look down on you because we think you're a bunch of yokels, right?"
Well,
Whereas if you're from here, it's like, "Oh, you must be prim and proper," because they still have that class mentality, you know.
yeah,
So apparently if you speak the king's English, that means you're all right. Oxbridge, top
receive
of the heap,
shit.
right?
Yeah,
Whereas if you're a Scouse, or if you're from Yorkshire, or if
yeah.
you're talking talking some sort of
Norfolk. Yeah.
accent, then they're like, oh yeah, you're just from the sticks. It's kind of the equivalent of how they would, of how people from New York would look at people from the South,
Oh
a
yeah.
bunch of bumpkins. um
Yeah, it's fascinating the number of dialects, and it's been a fascination of mine to try to learn as many of them as I can, but some of them are pretty out there.
but that's the thing though, because in my young mind, right, when I was taking acting classes, I always thought, the true mark of an actor isn't to make the scene your own, or to make us believe that you really are this person, or you're really experiencing these emotions.
Yeah.
It was the fact that if you could affect a convincing accent, that meant you were a really, really good actor, you know. Eh, but mind you, like, this was like all the way back in like middle school, high school
Oh
years. So I
yeah.
thought, so in my mind, so if I saw like an American actor and they couldn't do it, an accent, I just thought, well, he must be a really, really shit actor, right?
But he's like killing it method wise,
Exactly.
His
So
accent's terrible, but his acting is incredible.
right.
And
So
yet he's
yeah. So
terrible.
yeah. So for instance, like like Christopher Cooper, because I remember my drama teacher talking about how Christopher Cooper is one of those actors who's like underrated because he steals the scene in every movie that he's in, but he's never been
Hmm.
nominated.
Hmm.
I've never seen a movie where he's done an accent, but you know, but
Does
if
he
you
have
watch,
a little natural twang though?
I always thought that was just like, that was just his natural way of speaking,
Right.
because if you watch October Sky, I mean, I just assumed like that was his natural accent, like he was
Mm.
Homer's dad. Or if you watched one of the Spider-Man movies where he's like Norman Osborn, it's like, oh, I guess Norman Osborn has a Southern twang to him,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
I mean, the same would go for George Clooney, because George Clooney is a mighty fine actor, but
mhm.
obviously I've never seen him do an accent. And yet in my mind, I was like, well, yeah, he may have won a few Oscars, but I don't think he's a very good
He
actor.
just he can't do dialect, so he's bad. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'll forgive him anything for the Ocean's movies. Those were great.
exactly. So so we were talking about this earlier, but you did mention this at the beginning. You did mention that you were with Second City, and Second
Yep.
City does have a pretty stellar reputation for cranking out high profile stars
Yeah.
who've graced the screen probably since the late 60s, early 70s, because a lot of
1959. Yeah, it was founded.
59. Okay.
Mhm,
Yeah, because I remember reading somewhere that a lot of the people who started off with Lorne Michaels
mhm,
SNL at the time, they came from Second City.
mhm,
And some as recent as Cecily Strong and Adie Bryant, who
mhm.
I did not realize was in Second City. They've been on SNL and they've been killing it.
Yeah,
But can you talk a little bit about Second City, what it was like to be a part of it? Because I always
sure.
imagined it was kind of like, I always imagined Second City was like the American equivalent to the Cambridge Footlights, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I could see that. Uh, so here in Detroit, uh, the way it rolled out was the Ilitch family, who owns the Tigers and the Red Wings and the Fox Theater. They're kind of like the entertainment magnate of Detroit, right? And also consider, Second City opened in Detroit in the early '90s, which was the very beginning of our, depending on your point of view, like rebirth, renewal, right? Like when the white flight sort of U-turned and people started investing in the city again.
Mhm.
So one of the son of this, famous family had seen Second City in Chicago, was like, I want to bring it to Detroit. So it started in the early '90s. I got involved. I was cast in the touring company, I auditioned myself and 5 guys, and they needed a woman. So it worked out great for me. I got into the touring company there, and then after a short time, I was in the resident company there. And basically for that, you would do 7 shows a week. You would write a sketch show with the company, and then you would do free improv sets, each night after the shows to generate material for the next review. And so I was there for about 3 years. And during that time, they talk about it being the equivalent of a master's degree in comedy. I would say acting too, to some degree.
Right.
Because you have to be young to do this job, because you're just like, you rehearse all day, you do the show, you do the set, you're young, so you stay up, doing whatever you do all night.
So basically,
you do
it's
it
like
all
a full-time thing then, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, that was the job.
Okay.
And, so it was kind of cool to have a few years where it was like, I'm just a performer. And at that time too, they would put you on billboards and ads in the Joe Louis Arena at the time. So there was a certain amount of like regional treasure kind of treatment. So it was a very exciting time. And then you're still connected to like the mothership in Chicago, right? So it's an incredible networking thing for an actor. It's an incredible set of skills that you pick up. But also, the people that you're with, it's like it's almost like military buddies that you've gone through war with, right? Like there's a bonding that you experience there that is like no other.
So I'm assuming you've got like a tattoo somewhere. There was like, Second City 97, right?
Not yet, but I'm
it's like whenever you meet up, you're like, oh hey, I remember you. You like show each other's tattoos.
Yeah, well, it is funny because, we were talking before we recorded. Like most of the people out of Detroit would go to Chicago and then eventually LA. So like half my heart is in LA, and it's now been far more years than I would like to admit since those days, but still, I could call any one of those books and be like, I'm coming. Can I stay on your couch? Yes. I miss you. I love you. Let's be together. We're a family. And Detroit had an extremely like, just vibrant amount of talent in those late 90s years, at least in the community I was within, between the Second City and the Planet Ant Theater, and eventually a theater that opened called Go Comedy. There was just so many incredible people that came out of here at that time.
So did a lot of your friends and acquaintances, did they make that flight to LA?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, a lot of them got pulled into Second City shows in Chicago.
Right.
One of the things that I think worked in the favor of Detroit is that we were sort of ahead of the game in the diversity whole thing, because we always had people of color in our cast, which was important because we were a Black city. It would be completely disingenuous, because improv and sketch tended for many, many years to be like super white. So we had a lot of, so Keegan-Michael Key was here, and a lot of other really talented, BIPOC performers who would then be brought into these other spaces, Chicago predominantly, but also Toronto, because that community hadn't been fostered as much, I think, outside of Detroit.
So I do want to back up a little bit, because because you did mention something very, very important, because you said that being in Second City was sort of like getting an MFA in acting and theater. Was there an expectation, or was there like a requirement for you to have a substantial, like either a degree in theater or a substantial CV in theater before joining Second City?
That's an excellent question, and it's where I get I'll put my snooty hat on for a second. So I have, like I said, I have a BFA. So I'm at the core a theater person, but there's a huge spectrum within this art form of wackadoo comedy to really intense, like theatrical improvisation. You don't have to have a degree necessarily to be cast. I think during my time, and most of the time, like, if you are coming to this from theater, it's going to make you a lot better at it because it's still acting, right?
Mhm.
It's not stand-up. But I have seen some really incredible people, like Mark Warzeka, Tim Robinson, some of these folks that just went straight into it as very young people who didn't go to college for theater, and they're incredible. So it depends on the path and the person. But if I had my druthers, I think it's pretty important to have people with a degree, because when you're running a show, right. You could tell, and some of us would get snootier about it, like who had been trained to run shows over long periods of time, right? Because the actors in the group would work on their performance until they said it, and then we're going to perform that. Even though it'll be live and in the moment, we're not going to change lines or blocking or, throw our scene partners off in any way, because we've honed a show. Whereas some people who were less stringent on the theater would, I'm gonna throw something fun out and keep it live. And you're like,
that's amateur stuff, right?
Right. Or, oh, look at you breaking. Oh, you think it's so fun, like Jimmy
Or
Fallon laughing.
or ghosting your
right. Breaking character, and
Yeah, because as someone who did theater performance when I when I was younger, I mean, blocking was such an important thing.
Yeah.
So to me, that to try to do something spontaneous, that's like anathema. That's like, you can't do that.
I know.
That's sacrilegious.
I know. But if all the people in the show are the ones who wrote the show, it gets tricky.
Yeah. So walk me through this. So so obviously everybody's in on it, so to speak. How exactly are people able to kind of know when's their cue? Because because it kind of feels like if everybody's if you've got a bunch of chefs in the kitchen working on the same thing at one time, it can get a little bit confusing. So how do you kind of know how to handle the sort of ordered chaos, so to speak?
Well, there's two different things you're doing there. One is improv, and one is writing the show and sketch and stuff. So when we would write the shows, we would have a director. A lot of times, and this was really incredible, you would get an opportunity for some really veteran Second City people to come in, and then you would get a whole education out of that. So that director would, watch the sets, say, let's visit these scenes. During the day, you would, bring in scripts, very much like I'm sure what any other writer's room is like. Everybody's bringing in a bunch of sketches to see if they can get them in the show, So that is directed. When you're improvising, the thing you're relying on is everybody sort of has the same rule book or sensibility, because you've been trained in this same theater with their same sort of yes and approach, and all of these sort of concepts of like, don't start the scene as strangers, try to avoid questions, like all of these things that if you follow them and are able to connect to and listen to your partner, you can find some pretty amazing stuff.
So now that you mentioned that, are those like the rules that everybody has to follow? Like you can't deviate from that premise?
I think like any art form, some of the most incredible things break all the rules, right? But I think like any art form, you still have to learn your scales before you can play Mozart or Beethoven or whatever.
Right.
So you got to know the rules to be able to break them. But I mean, I think one of the main things is if you can find that, and it's the same in any art form, that lovely pocket of the zone where, the people that are playing are super connected and they're riding the, sort of vibe of the scene, and not trying to stand there and say funny lines to each other. You can kind of do anything.
Gotcha. So walk me through what was your process like when you were in Second City? Like what did you what did you learn? Who did you connect with, and how did you
Mhm.
find your niche
Mhm.
in developing your skills as a writer and as an actor, and how did that translate into what you're doing, what you were
Mm.
doing later on in life?
That's an excellent question.
It's a loaded question. That's
It
what
is.
it
It's
is.
a big one. Well, the funny thing is, during that time, so we had this really amazing director called Ron West. He was on, I think, the British Who's Line. Uh, we called him the doctor because he was like the script doctor. He could make your stuff into really good stuff when it started off not very good.
Right.
But he used to talk about on paper people, right? So in the cast, there would be people who loved to write it down and come in with this scene completely fleshed out, and there were other people like myself and Keegan who would much prefer to come at it from an acting perspective and would be more figuring it out on stage. So at the time I was not a writer. I didn't like to sit down and write. It was not my thing at all. I was an actor, but now I'm a writer. And I think that was from that training, right? I think the really hugest thing you get out of that training is the ability to collaborate well, because you have so many instances where you have to surrender yourself to the better of the scene or the show
Right.
or the song or whatever the thing is. And then you see it succeed and realize I'm a cog in the machine, right? Uh,
You're not a
so
special snowflake.
no, no. Or, like some of what we did was re-improvising. So you would improvise a scene and like there'd be an amazing line I discovered one night. And then the next night in that moment, I would go to say it and somebody next to me would totally pooch it and say it for me and they'd get a bigger laugh. And while I was mad at them for stealing my line, I'd be like, I just wrote a really successful line. Somebody else is saying it. Um, so you learn collaboration and also some flexibility. But then the other thing that came out of it for me was this sort of validation as a writer to say, wait a minute, I am a writer. I wrote 10 years worth of shows. So that when I wrote my first play, it was like, well, why wouldn't I write a play? I know how to write a play. I wrote a million scenes. Let's just put them together. And so that then when I wanted to write a book, I was like, well, I could write a book. I've written a million plays, so every next step was validated from that initial experience.
So, so I've been down the same path as you because I dreaded writing. Like
Mm,
I always thought, I can perform, I can do this and that, but writing is not for me. And I think the hardest part was writing in a way that you heard the other person's voice in your head, and so
mm,
that when you wrote it, it didn't sound like you were saying it. It kind of sounded
yes.
like someone else is saying it. I mean, I'm sure that must have like clicked in your head when when you wrote your first play or your first scene, and you're like, wow, this is totally sounds like something that someone else would say, and I'm okay with that.
Yeah. I mean, and again, that's from the time of not being an on paper person, right?
Hmm.
To today, I still approach everything the same way. And it's this: if I create a character, I'm approaching it as an actor saying, if I were playing that character, what would be important to me? What would be my motivation? What would I use to change the other person's mind? You know what I mean? Like, what's my
Yeah.
quirk? Like, do I like to chew gum? And did I quit smoking and now I eat licorice? Like, what is it? Um, and honestly, I'll tell you this. My real writing process is during my half-hour commute to the city is just like saying the story out loud, playing the characters, like
Right.
to myself, playing an improv set alone in the car. I'm sure I look like a nut in traffic, but
Well, that
'cause
makes two
that's
of well, that makes
making
two
the
of us
character.
then.
Do you do the same?
Yeah.
Oh, yes. So do you write film stuff?
Um. Yeah. Yeah. So I went to film school. Well,
Okay.
I actually well, it's not really film school. I went to a school with a film program,
Okay.
and initially, initially when I was required to write scenes, because everybody has to take an intro to screenwriting class, right?
Yeah.
So so when I sat down to write my first scene, I was just like, how the hell am I going to square this? Because none of this makes sense. It's all on paper, and you come to realize, if you actually like talk it out, like walking around and actually talking the scene out, talking as if you were in that character, you begin it begins to flow out, and then you're like, okay, I gotta slow down. I gotta be able to write all of this down because because it's just like with anything. It's like when you're learning something, yeah, you can write it down, but it's not going to make any sense unless you actually like try to like work it out. Either
Yeah.
like a good example is studying a foreign language, right?
Mhm.
You can listen to all these tapes and write and read all these articles, but it's not going to click until you actually practice speaking the language.
Yeah.
So
Immersion.
yeah, exactly. And I think you'll agree with this too. When you're in that writing process, you have to immerse yourself in that role,
Mhm.
which would include trying to speak in the guise of that character. And and as you do it more and more often, you begin to become more comfortable to the point where I don't want to sound crazy, but you kind of have the split personality where
Oh,
it's
yeah.
like where it's like there's me, right? But then there's the character that I'm developing, and I'm not that character, and that character is not me, but I understand very well what makes this person tick,
Yeah.
and it becomes second nature because it's like, because when you hand the script off to somebody, and you're like, all right, this is what I want you to do. If the person's not getting it, yeah, yeah. I mean, you can get a bit defensive, but at the same time,
Sure.
like you mentioned yourself, with learning how to collaborate, you have to learn how to take, you know, input from other people and kind of like merge it into the character that you're creating because yeah, you created this character, and yeah, I mean you spend a lot of time trying to develop who this person is, but at the end of the day, you're not playing that person. You're handing that person off to this actor who is going to take on that role for you, and they have to be able to assume you, you know assume that character but make it feel natural. So
Yeah.
obviously, so obviously, if you say things a certain way, obviously, obviously that'd be nice if the actor could say it that way, but if it doesn't sound natural to them, you kind of have to be man enough or woman enough to realize, I can let this person tweak it a little bit to make it sound natural, as long as they keep the core of who that person is,
Absolutely.
and remain
It's
faithful to
hard.
it. Oh, I mean, so I do have to ask. So what was it like, learning to collaborate for the first time? Because I can't imagine it's very easy when you start off because what you think is funny, another person may not think is funny at all, and you're like, well, what do you mean it's not funny? Like, do you want to
Mhm.
like, sir, do you want to go outside? I'll show you what's funny.
Mhm. Yeah, I have some challenges, or at least in the beginning. Oh, no, I still have them. I mean, I'm an Aquarius and a youngest child, so there are definitely times where I like dig my heels in.
Right.
Like my critique group will tell you, like, I'm like, yeah, but it's a good idea, so stop giving me notes on it. My husband will break his neck nodding at me saying I can dig my heels in. But for the most part, my hope is to have the approach of like, hey, and this is how I am as a manager at work, or at least I like to think I am, is like, I believe that I have a finite amount of ideas. And while, a lot of them are brilliant, there's so much more. And so if I have a team that I'm working with, the exponential increase of the possibilities bringing their ideas to the table, I mean, makes us able to do so much.
Right.
So really, honestly, the hardest part of getting good at collaborating isn't just the like dealing with the disappointment when somebody isn't like falling all over themselves about your idea. It's legit hearing and embracing somebody else's idea. And I mean, that's that whole concept of yes and, right? But it's because we always talk about I don't know if I should swear, but it's like BS my line, BS my line, right? It's like
Yeah,
whatever you
exactly.
have to say, fine, just get it out of the way because I want to say the thing that I have to say, right? But to actually slow down and like hear what the other person's saying and really trying to understand that idea and then give it a try, like fly it up the flagpole. I mean, that's where the real good type of surrender is in collaboration.
Yeah, and then the moment comes when you realize, oh shit, they were right the entire
Oh
time.
God. Oh, I know. I mean, and
It-
you feel like this really grown up person that you let it finally get to that place, but then you're also like, oh, what a petulant jerk I was in the beginning. You know? Like,
well, the cherry on top is when you sit there and you're like, damn, like, why didn't I think of that?
or
It's
also
what
like, why did I fight it for so long?
I
You know?
know, and then
Like,
I know, and then you have to go outside and bang your head against the wall because you're like, I
oh.
can't believe myself. So,
And then you think of the idea that you wanted to do instead and how awful it is in comparison. You know, like, oh, why was I fighting for the donut shop scene? This hockey thing is way better, you know.
so I want to talk more about the comedy scene in Detroit
Mhm,
because obviously you mentioned Second City started off in the 90s, but then
mhm,
a lot of the talent kind of transitioned. They moved to Chicago first,
mhm.
and then they migrated to LA, and then to a lesser degree New York City. What what's the scene been like since since that period? Like, have there been any has there been like a renaissance of talent, or is there like a certain like dearth of comedic talent, or what's going on up there?
Well, it's interesting because, I think my perspective post pandemic is a little more limited than it would have been because once it was like I played every Monday night. Like that was our night at Planet Ant for 20 plus years. I played every Monday night. And then it was
Mhm.
like, oh, I can stay home. I have to stay home, right? It was during COVID. But then it was like, I don't really want to go anywhere on a Monday night after work. So I'm less well versed in, like what the talent level is or whatever. But activity wise, it never stopped. And I am proud of that because I was definitely part of that. I think the time when I left in 99, there was sort of a sense of like, if you didn't leave town, you weren't serious about this thing, right?
Yeah.
Like you might be talented, but you just didn't have what it took because you didn't leave. And full disclosure, I'm like a plus size actress, right? Or hate the word actress, but I'm a woman of size who is an actor. And that does not have a very bright, happy future in LA, just to be honest, with like the types of things bless her, A.D. Bryant, who, made a huge difference with things like Shrill and being in that place. But so it wasn't a life that I was really like seeking out. And in the theater, I can be a lot of different things, but on film, I have to be certain things, right? So, and also, for lots of other reasons, family and just there were things to do here that I was interested in doing. So I stayed.
All right.
So, some friends and I established the program at the Planet Ant. And then, like I said, this Go Comedy opened shortly thereafter. There have been different entities within Ann Arbor, which is about 45 minutes from Detroit. So that's still kind of regionally, the scene. But and now Planet Ant is like multiple spaces and they have a stand-up spot. Now the old Second City space, because Second City was only here through probably the early 2000s, like 2006 or so.
Right.
Um now that old space downtown has become a stand-up theater. So I do think that like comedy is on a resurgence right now. Um but I'm like a different generation than a lot of the people that are doing it. So I'm not as keyed into it. But one thing I can tell you stylistically about Detroit, and especially for those of us who came out of it before the city was really sort of fixed up, is like we have hustle. Like there's this whole Detroit hustles harder, right? And
Yeah.
um, and we're very loyal to one another. And I think part of that comes out of like if your city has been the punchline for everybody's joke for many years or looked down on, you have each other to rely on, right? So even when everybody was out in LA or Chicago or whatever, Detroiters are together, right? And support each other.
Right.
Um,
They remember their roots, right?
yeah, for sure. But also like there's also a really strong um desire for authenticity in the work. So kind of that character stuff you were talking about of like, it's not necessarily over the top characters. We're not, like silly, like some of the British humor might be. It's a lot of really rooted, but we go hard for sure.
Like a slice of life kind of comedy.
Mm-hmm.
Gotcha.
Yeah. No fronting, like no putting on airs or anything. Everything is like, it's okay to be stripped down and is what it is, kind of,
So to circle back, because you said that that you're teaching these classes to the younger generation. What kind of what have you seen with with these younger talent? Like what are you trying to? I mean, I don't want to make it sound like you're brainwashing anybody, but what are you trying to impart? What kind of lessons are you trying to impart on younger talent as they're making their way up in the scene?
Yeah, my work with the Y has been a real blessing because it allowed me to sort of push out stuff and invest in youth, and that's a beautiful thing. One of the things we really try to do is help develop an understanding of the creative process and how that can be a platform for your voice as a young person. I think one of the things that we make the mistake of when approaching, especially teens with programming, is what do we want them to do, right? Or what do we want to teach them?
Right.
And if you've
they're so impressionable,
Oh, for sure. And what they really want is to be little versions of crusty old adults. Like they're dying for that.
Never.
No. But if you've ever watched or been an adult talking at a room full of teenagers, you understand how ineffective that approach really is.
Mm-hmm.
But also, I think some of these intergenerational, now I'm Gen X, right? So I'm not in the generation wars. I get to sit on the side with the popcorn. But some of the challenges we have intergenerationally are similar to the conversation we just had about collaboration, right? Like we're not listening to each other or understanding where the other one's coming from. And so in our work, especially in the media program, it's really about like, I'm not here to tell you what to say in this video. I'm going to obviously like, it's the why. So I want to keep the content somewhere within our core values, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But what I'm here to do is to teach you how to develop and tell an effective story. And I'm here to teach you how to visually represent that story in the medium of video, film, but video.
Right.
And then you're going to pour yourself into it and you're going to say the things you want to say, right? We might frame, like through the festival this year, we did My Money, My Future, right? Because we did a focus group, because then we even learned this lesson, Nick and I did, of instead of us saying, what do we think young people want to talk about that's socially relevant? We did a focus group with the young people from the year before to say, what do you want to say that's socially relevant?
Yeah, that actually makes sense. Like, why don't we just ask them what they're concerned about?
You'd be so surprised though, like, and to me, not just everyone around me, to me in this work, like how many times you relearn the lesson of just ask them. Because, there's always like, I wonder what they would think. It's like, I don't know. Why don't you ask them?
Well, it's funny because I remember watching an episode of the Vietnam War, the documentary by Ken Burns, and and there was this clip that they played from the David Frost show where this where Spiro Agnew was brought onto the show to talk to these younger kids, and one of the interviewers was like, she told Spiro Agnew, she was like, I mean, you're basically misrepresenting us. You're making our parents be afraid of us, and that's not the case at all. I mean, and I feel like that's the case today, because I remember reading an article, surprise, surprise, Fox News. But I do want to be fair. I read from all news sources because I want to be equal in everything.
Well, and understand all of the perspectives before you make your decisions.
Yeah, exactly. And the article was saying how Gen Zers were basically basically coming up with all these misconceptions about Gen Xers, and Gen Xers were like, hold on, where are you getting this information from? That is not who we are at all.
Oh my gosh.
And I just feel like I just feel like there's a lot of misrepresentation, and
Yeah.
what's even sadder is the fact that some not I'm not saying all of them, but some people within those generational groups have pretty much, to use your phrase, have dug their heels in and
Mhm.
have refused to budge. And I think what you're doing is, is very important, because it's breaking down those generational barriers and kind of creating a dialogue where you guys can communicate with each other, because obviously, generations aren't, they're not always going to be able to communicate in the same way, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm a millennial, so the stuff that, that would vibe with me, obviously, wouldn't necessarily vibe with you, but they
Mhm.
wouldn't necessarily, but what I think and what I believe wouldn't vibe with someone who was, who's of a younger generation,
Yeah.
right? So so obviously what you're doing is very much it, if not totally eliminating it, just breaking down the barriers to the point where they can kind of communicate effectively and get their point across without having to resort to these misconceptions and these stereotypes that you're reading in these articles,
Yep. Yeah.
So
Yeah, I was appropriately checked, and this made a huge difference for me because now I am like hugely invested in the Y has diversity, equity, inclusion global committee, and I'm really invested in that at work. And part of it was this experience, and you're a millennial, so you will know this.
mhm.
Early on with millennials, there was so much trash talk about millennials, right? Because
Yep, 2008 to 2013, I remember it
yes,
quite well.
yes, right in that
Oh,
era.
by the way, Mr. Ridley Scott, F you. Just saying.
Oh, was he leading the charge?
I mean, you remember that movie, The Last Duel?
No.
It was basically, Ben Affleck and Matt Damon dressed up as knights in medieval France, and it bombed in the box office. And Ridley Scott basically
Yeah,
said
they
the
wouldn't be the
reason.
guys I would cast in that kind of thing, but
Yeah, so Ridley Scott basically said the reason why the movie bombed was because millennials just didn't get it, and everybody was up in arms. And I was like, you know what? Fuck you, Ridley Scott.
honest
It.
to God.
I saw the movie, Margaret. If you watch that movie, you will agree it is trash, right?
Sure it is.
And
I mean,
and and
I don't have to. The two of them doing a historical like costume drama. Mm-mm. That's not the millennials' fault.
no, it's just Mr. Ridley Scott's fault, and he compounded it by making Napoleon, which is
Is going over
sometimes
just as well. Yeah.
right. I mean, it's one of those times I wish I was blind, because what the hell was this?
You want to like wish you had the little thing from Men in Black so you could erase your memory.
Yeah,
of the movie.
exactly.
Yeah, well, so during that time, I was just as bad as anyone because, there were things coming up like at work. They were like, millennials will need more feedback and you need to adjust that. I'm like, like everything that millennials did with like, I want to work from home more. Well, at the time, nobody did that. So I'm like, how dare you? This is where work happens. And like all these things that they wanted to change. And we'll get to this in a second, but I think all of these culture and generational problems are about dealing with change. But so at the time, I really jumped 2 feet first into those dang millennials, right? And then I shared this article on Facebook that was about like, oh, these millennials just want life to be like a unicorn or something. There was something like, oh, they're the, participant medal children and this and that kind of thing.
It didn't help that the hipster was a thing at that time too.
And that was in the hipster era. Exactly.
Yep.
So a friend of mine, or like a, more than acquaintance, but not like call each other kind of friends, called me out like on Facebook in the comments, like, you know me, and I'm a millennial and I'm offended that you posted this because I'm not like this. And thank you for, the gross generalization there. And I heard it. And I caught myself. And then I was like, wow, I just stereotype, broad brushed an entire generation publicly. And I took my lumps. And ever since I, took people one person at a time versus, and it's made a huge difference. And now the millennials are like 40. So
yeah, most of us have white hair now. So
right. But a lot of it was, I don't like that you want to change my workplace. You're the one coming in, so you should do what I say. Like those kinds of things. And
Well,
now
I was
people
gonna
don't want to
say.
say pronouns, and then they get upset about that.
Well, I was gonna say because because back in the 80s and 90s, I mean, the boomers were basically saying, "Oh, those Gen Xers, like, what the hell's
Yeah.
going on with them?" And obviously, REM encapsulated in a wonderful song, "What's the Frequency Count?" Because
Mm,
because obviously everybody during that time was trying to figure out what the hell's going on with these kids because nobody could figure out what was going on with them because they're just lazy. Apparently, they're all sniffing glue. And what is the deal with wearing flannel?
mm.
Like, is everybody turned into a lumberjack or something? So,
Uh-huh. Well, here's the thing that everybody missed, right? And I can tell you this from the inside because this is my time.
mhm.
Grunge and this, everybody's a stoner who doesn't want to do anything with their lives came from we're the OGs of not going to do as well as our parents, right? So like when and I do honestly feel for millennials and Gen Z because the economic situation is just out of control.
Yeah,
But
because by comparison, what was going on in the late 80s, early 90s, was pretty tame compared to what happened in 2008 and to what's happening right
absolutely.
now.
But I feel like we were one of, and we're not the first ones to ever, because every generation is like a rehash of another one. But of those that are alive now, we're we came after the literal boom. Like everybody was going to have a pension and a house and maybe even a cottage and a vacation and all these things. And we were made clearly aware early on that this wasn't going to be the case for us. And me as an artist, I knew it wasn't going to be the case for me. Like I was going to be lucky to have health insurance, So, I mean, when you know that no matter how hard you work, you're only going to get so far. And then on top of it, all of your popular culture is like, let's be mad and wear flannel and like, oh, what's the movie? It's Winona Ryder and Ethan Hawke and Ben Stiller was like the preppy guy in it. I can't think of it, but it's like the grunge Bible, like the
Reality Bites.
Yes, Reality Bites. It's the Millennium. I'm sorry, the Gen X Bible. Like,
Right.
if you want to know what Gen Xers thought or behaved like in that time, that's your movie. Like that and Singles and like a couple other ones where it's like, we're more interested in being cool. And, look, as I look back on Reality Bites, I'm like, Ben Stiller was kind of annoying, but he had such a great job. Like why are we going for Ethan Hawke, the troubled guy who treats you like crap? Because that's what we did. But we were really in this sort of leaning into our Eeyorehood as a generation because
because y'all were the angry generation. I remember that.
And then we just like kind of put our heads down, tried to figure it all out, and disappeared into the wings. And then everybody started fighting. We were like, oh. And then they don't even list us in the demographic lists, like we're like, that's fine.
Really?
Well, I mean, there's always articles or things. There was like a graphic going around that was like from, some local or maybe cable news thing that was like, here's what Gen Z is like, here's what millennials are like, here's what boomers are like. And we're like,
that's right. That's right. Because I remember
all the time.
I remember reading an article like a few years ago, and they're like, the baby boomers, from this period, there's like there's like a huge spike, and obviously they're going to show those bar graphs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then they're like from like 1980 to 1995, these are the millennials, and it's like this huge spike, and then Gen Z, and then like in between the boomers and the millennials, you had like this small little lump, and they're like, yeah, this is Gen X. I'm like,
I don't think you were a big window either, right?
Yeah, because y'all had like the smallest window because you were between 65 and 79, I think. Whereas with the boomers, obviously they went from 45 to 60, 64. It was like
post-war till Beatles came.
Yeah, basically, and then my generation, basically anybody born from the 80s up until what I like to say the end of Pete and Pete were millennials. Right?
Anyone born during dial-up, basically.
Yeah, exactly. So Margaret, I want to go and just wrap things up a bit. I mean, we could talk about this generational thing. Like,
I mean,
seriously.
that was, speaking of non sequiturs, that was amazing.
I mean, you want to know what's funny? Is like back in high school, my sophomore year English teacher said, Luca, you are a non sequitur, because I was just all over the place, and then I was like, I'm gonna make it my title. I'm gonna call myself the non
That's
sequitur.
great.
So so that's where we are now. But if people are interested, are learning more about you, or following you, or reaching out to you, where can they do that?
So for my YMCA life, so that would be, you could go to our site. It's ymcadetroit.org/yarts, all one word. And that'll kind of cover the work we do in the community. That also will have information about the Detroit Can Film Festival, DCFF.
Right.
And then for my the theater that I founded the stuff in is called Planet Ant Theater, so that'd be planetant.com. And then for my author life, my pen name is Maggie Elliott, Eliot, 1L1T. And I have a book coming out. My debut is coming out March 26th.
Ooh, excellent. We'll be we'll be sure to put a link in there, and I'll definitely love to have you come back on to chat more about writing, because I could just talk to you for hours and hours about some
Same.
topics.
This is fun.
So before we wrap up, obviously, as this is a movie podcast, I have to ask, what's your favorite movie or TV show that you've seen recently you just feel needs to get a shout out, like right now, that's not Reality Bites?
Well, it's kind of appropriate that we were talking about the 90s, because I had been so salty for so long that this series had not been streaming, and they had been fighting over music rights, and it's finally on Prime, and I have been living in it. Northern Exposure. I have been watching it incessantly.
Right.
It came out in 1990. I don't know if you're familiar, but it's doctor who was put through med school by the state of Alaska. He's like a New York Jew. He has to do then so many years of practice in the state to pay back, them paying his degree. And they didn't have room in the hospital at Juneau or wherever. So they put him in like the middle of nowhere in Alaska. And it's just like an ensemble cast. I love anything like Gilmore Girls or anything like that has like a small town ensemble cast with like lots of great variety of characters. And this is totally one of those. So,
it kind of reminds me of that series Everwood with Treat Williams.
Well, I don't know it. I'll have to look at it.
Okay. Yeah. It was a show that came out on the WB way back like in the early 2000s.
Okay.
And from what you're describing, because I sort of remember Northern Exposure, but not too much, because I was starting kindergarten around.
You're a millennial baby. I know.
I might as well just say it, just because I got nothing to hide. I was born in '87, so by the time
I was a sophomore in high school.
Yeah, so by the time they came out, I was pretty much just like still learning how to.
You were 3.
Poop.
Yeah.
I was learning how to poop, and I got my stuffed bunny rabbit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I wasn't saying no. I was just saying ow, because I kept getting spanked a lot. Because
yeah.
I was
Honestly,
one of those.
3 is
I was
worse
one of
than
those.
2.
I was one of those kids who like to draw on the walls, and apparently. But if you watch my cartoons on the channel, you'll see what it was like. So.
Yeah, it was not for no reason, right?
But Northern Exposure, I mean, I'll tell you what, because I have been going down memory lane recently, right? I started watching Quantum Leap, the original series, not the revival one. So I just got on to season 2. I'm on episode 5 right now. The thing is that I've been doing this thing where I'll watch one episode of Quantum Leap, and then I will watch one episode of Star Trek Enterprise, right? Because Quantum
a Next Generation person, but yes.
Because Quantum Leap came out when I was in diapers, and then Enterprise came out when I was in middle school.
Okay.
So for me for me it's just such a fun exercise to kind of see Scott Bakula then. And Scott Bakula. Then, Scott Bakula as a time traveling scientist, and then Scott Bakula as the
space traveling scientist.
Yeah, first captain of the Enterprise.
Right. That's
so,
crazy.
so yeah, that's what I'm doing right now. But I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to watch this episode and just being patient with our non sequiturs, because we did go off tangent a lot. But you know what? It's a podcast, and we have these guests who want to make them feel comfortable. So we are going to riff a little bit. Nothing wrong with that, and it does give us an opportunity to bring our guests back on for future episodes. But remember to like, comment, subscribe, and please share this video with everybody that you know, because the more watching, the more views that we get, the more attention we get, the bigger our audience can grow. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one. Ciao. Welcome back to another episode of Thespians, and today we have an old friend back on the show, Margaret Edwartowski, and we are going to chat about what it means to be a writer and what it's like writing from the female perspective. But before we dive in, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and just show us some a little bit of love, because I've looked at the numbers here. I feel a little sad. I crawl in my bed and sob for a little bit. So if you can give us some love and hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, I would definitely appreciate that. But Margaret, how are you doing on this fine Sunday afternoon?
I'm great, and thanks for having me back. I'm excited.
Yeah, exactly. And, well, because the first time we chatted, we were talking about your time with Second City, and your and your work as an actress and as a writer, as well as organizing the film festival in Detroit. But what really piqued my interest was the fact that you're a writer. And I wanted to have you come back on because I wanted to talk about what it's like writing from a female perspective, because from my experience, whenever I'm writing stories or scripts or anything like that, whenever I'm writing for a female role, I kind of feel a bit apprehensive, because I'm not entirely sure how to approach females, because because when it comes to writing for females, typically we kind of fall into either one of two stock characters. It's either the straight-laced person who's the voice of reason in a world where men kind of have the right or the privilege to act crazy, or they're usually like the damsel in distress, which would seem to be the majority of what you see in a lot of films and TV shows. Yeah. So I wanted to go ahead and just dive right in. So when we last spoke, like I said, we were chatting about your time with Second City, and when you started out, you were mainly just working with comedic writing, correct?
Well, I started as an actor, got a theater degree, and then I got into Second City, but I had always been a character actor. So comedy or comedic acting was definitely my milieu. But then once you're at Second City, it's funny when you're just an actor, a lot of times don't think about the writing as being your thing. But Second City kind of thrusts you into that, and is really a boot camp, especially for sketch writing, but definitely for building a everyday writing habits, because you just work such an intense amount, and it's great, and you're young, so it's great, but that's what kind of turned the corner for writing for me.
Yeah, and that was interesting, because it was kind of like a sink or swim kind of mentality. It's like you either do this or you don't. Damn if you do, damn if you don't, kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, and it plays to your competitive nature too, because you gotta. I mean, it's definitely much more, from what I've understood, for Saturday Night Live, much more competitive in this aspect. But you have to push your characters and ideas forward to get stuff into the show, and it's definitely like a shots on goal approach, where it's like, okay, those 6 scenes I brought in, none of them landed. Let's try another one. Let's try something new. So you just keep trying.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of a story I read about the Pythons when they were writing a sketch, because they would go away, they would write something, and they would come back together, and they would kind of put it to a vote to see which sketches were worth performing. Was it kind of the same environment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, and I'm sure everybody thinks that their home turf is the best, but Detroit is a specifically wonderful place, and especially at that time, because we were still in a very underdog place, right? You'd spent your whole growing up, every movie is like, oh, we're gonna send them to Detroit, like it's a punishment, So we definitely had that like hand in hand through the war kind of vibe, but also we just definitely had a very supportive group that was very much a family. So so there was a lot more of the let me help you get a leg up kind of approach. So there would definitely be like, hey, I know all of your characters. I brought in this scene for that, coach guy you play and that teacher that she plays or whatever. And you would kind of help each other out because you knew what was on the buffet, so to speak.
So you're in Second City and you're you're writing your first sketch. Can you talk about what was the process like? What was going through your head as you were trying to figure out what kind of characters am I going to use? What kind of situations am I putting them in? What kind of jokes or where's the punchline gonna enter the scene to kind of let you know, hey, this is the moment where you got to laugh.
Well, the thing that I think is really helpful for an actor making that transition in that Second City realm is you're going to improvise. A lot of times you'll just come in with a scene pitch, like an idea, basically some characters you played or something that you discovered out of a set, because you play a set every night after your shows. And then you come in with that, and then during rehearsals, you can just kind of like riff through it. One of the very first ones that I remember doing was with Larry Joe Campbell, who ended up on According to Jim for a lot of years. And then Josh Funk, who was a big, was running the Second City in LA for a long time. The two of them, and it was this rare thing that like the two of them were big guys. I'm a big gal. So it ended up being this thing that they were my two uncles, and somebody had called me fat or something happened that was very like about fat. And I, came to them and they did hilarious jokes about it or whatever. But it was one of the first times that it had been something that either came out of a set that I did or, that I was the driving force on. And because I had so much respect for these two guys and I was the newbie, like I just felt this pressure to get it right, and then the director would kind of say, okay, next time you guys go improvise it, try these couple of things. And then they would videotape the shows, and then you would transcribe, a copy, and you would do that a few times and sort of marry the best of it together. So it was kind of quilting, right?
Yeah.
So it was I think it's a really healthy way to learn effective scene writing, because you're taking this thing that was this living in the moment thing where you were playing off of the audience to see how it worked, and then picking the best, tried out in front of people stuff.
Well, that's fascinating too, because you said that you were working with with two with two veterans, right? Or at least two well established comedians. Because in that situation, did you kind of feel like you kind of had to go with whatever they were telling you? So like say for instance, if you were let's just make it simple. If it was like a Thanksgiving dinner and they came back and said no, you got to change it to like Valentine's Day, that's way more funnier. Did you just acquiesce, or were there times where you're like, I know what I put down as funny. I want to stick with this because I know I can, we can get something out of it. Did that ever occur?
A lot of times those kinds of changes would come from a director, sometimes from within, but it did take, I think I was probably better at making those adjustments then than I am now, because I was working collaboratively. Because there were so many times, I guess 1,000 times, where I came in with a scene that was like, oh, it's this father and daughter in a sandwich shop, and like you play it enough times, and the director changes enough, and then it's like they're in a foxhole and they're cousins, like, but it's the same scene, but it's not, I came in with this one. They were building Comerica Park in Detroit, and I came in with this scene about stadium opening day, and it was based off of My Fair Lady, that Ascot opening day thing. It was very like highbrow, thing. And then by the end, once everybody had collaborated, it was this super funky, like Motown, know, very totally different song, but a huge, accomplishment. Like we loved it. The audiences loved it. So it was like, well, I don't care that it wasn't My Fair Lady at that point. Like it worked out,
Right.
But surrender is a big thing in that art form too. Like it's, yes, and you gotta say, well, I had another idea, but we're going with yours,
Yeah, and that's really the crux of collaboration, because not only do you kind of have to compromise, but you also have to realize that sometimes if you want something to work, sometimes you got to go with something that may not necessarily be yours.
Yeah. It's ego. The other thing that's tough is like there would be stuff if we would improvise a scene and I would say a line, and then the next night, somebody else would say that same line before I got to it, and they would get a huge laugh, and then you're like, well, you know what, keep it. Yeah. But then now my satisfaction is I know I wrote it, like which was a kind of a good bridge for playwriting, because then it was like all the stuff you're giving away, you're not performing any of it, but that satisfaction of like somebody saying my words,
Yeah. So another thing that I'm curious too is because you said that that a lot of the performances were improv, but yet you're writing these sketches. Can you talk a little bit about how do you write for improv? It sounds sounds like a contradiction right there, writing for improv, really. But
right.
how do you go about doing that?
So improv was the tool to create the scene. So if you go to a Second City main stage show, there will be a sketch show that is written and honed and rehearsed and refined. And then after that, there'll be usually an improvised set. And that's where they mine the material. So it's used as a tool, and different directors use it differently. There's a guy from Toronto, Michael Gelman, who I learned an incredible amount from. And he's a re-improvised guy. So you never like wrote stuff down till the very end, probably. Even then you just kept playing it and you kept honing it until like you didn't have to memorize lines because you had just re-improvised it so many times, so
fascinating.
Yeah, that's actually how I write books now, in the car alone playing all the parts because I just keep talking it out to myself.
Okay, so rather than just like rather than just try to develop something new, you kind of take something that's existing and you keep working it over and over again until you've got something down. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. This time when I do the dead parrot sketch, when I go out on stage and pretend to do the dead parrot sketch, the guy's gonna get really mad, and then this is gonna happen. You just keep like, tweaking it, and then once it seems like the best things remain.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because because I've never heard of that concept before, improvisation. Would you? I mean, one could look at it and say, well, isn't that kind of lazy, because you're not coming up with anything new? You're just taking the same thing and kind of working it over and over again until until it's kind of reduced to like rote memorization.
Well, and it's funny too, because like so many times that you go out to improvise, there are, doubting Thomases who will never believe that improv is, made up, right? There's so many times like, well, you guys rehearsed that beforehand. No, we didn't. But I think that kind of stuff was usually just when we were like in a process. So there would be times you've opened a show and then you don't rehearse for, depending on the theater, you run that show for 8 months. You're not, getting material. And then there is a rehearsal process of 8 weeks or so where you are mining stuff. So that is the time. And I totally get what you're saying. Like you're doing something you already know kind of where it's going. It's not true improv, and it isn't. It's kind of workshopping stuff, And sometimes we would do that within the guise of previews and actually put it into the show. So you're sort of like pulling out things and putting new things into the actual show, while it's still running, and people get a cheaper ticket because you're just trying it out,
Right. So again, I'm just playing devil's advocate here. So that would sort of be like almost like a safety net then for the performers, because rather than possibly go with something that may or may not be familiar to everybody, or has the potential to, not be as funny as the material that you're familiar with. If you keep going back to this material and keep mining it and reworking it, you kind of know what the end result is going to be. Sort of like an inside joke with the performers, really.
Sure. I mean, and if you think about it, and I'm a little bit talking out of school, but I think that there's elements of this in stand-up, and probably musicians do similar too, of like, we're going to try out something that we're working on.
Yeah.
To see fly up the flagpole kind of thing. The nice thing about that is usually then by the time you get to opening night, it's not like are they going to buy it? Because you've played it in front of people before. So you have some sense.
Yeah, and that's actually a pretty good analogy about stand-up comedians, because because with stand-up comedians, you're expecting them to do the bits that you love and that you're familiar with, right? So it kind of
same with a concert. Yeah,
exactly. So in a way, it's part of the repertoire, and it's kind of an expectation where, if they don't perform it, you're just sitting there scratching, well, what the hell did I just pay all this money for? I came here to see the Dead Parrot sketch, for example.
Well, and one of the things I love when you watch stand-up is when they're workshopping a joke and it goes poorly, and they just straight up say like, well, that one's not going in, like, well, I tried that one and it failed. Anyway, next thing,
But at the same time, you don't want to, just reduce yourself to just relying on the old bits. Obviously, you want to keep pushing yourself, and writing new material. What kind of what inspires you, or what kind of situations or people kind of get the creative juices flowing to where you're like, I think this would make a pretty good sketch, or I think this might make a pretty good story?
Well, it kind of depends on what arena I'm writing in, right? What would inspire me from a sketch perspective versus playwriting versus writing books are all sort of different. But I would say, like, if overall for voice, for me, like an approach, I have kind of a like 80% comedic, 20%, a little bit of drama. And then but for me, what I'm really, really drawn to is like authentically human things, especially like vulnerable, real human stuff. I think because me as a performer and a comedian, like I always sort of not aired my dirty laundry, but definitely was like, hey, here's a thing that is super stupid and embarrassing about me. Like that's what you do for comedy. You show like, I have a giant nose and I'll never remember words or whatever your thing is, and kind of capitalize on it. But I think that's what, everyone I know in comedy has a little bit of a geeky side, and part of that is like we learned to be funny as a like coping mechanism, right? Like of not being the beautiful popular. I mean, I'm sure there's beautiful people in comedy, but you get what I'm saying. Like,
yeah. So do you think your acting kind of helps you in writing, or does writing help you as an actor?
I would say the way I use it now is definitely my acting helps my writing. It helps a ton. Like as a novelist, I'm what they call a pantser, fly by the seat of your pants. So I outline, but I don't really have a plan. And that is all from my trusting improv moment,
Yeah.
And character development too, because I've developed characters on stage live in front of people. Like that, I think has really helped develop characters as a writer too.
Yeah, it's almost like a reflex or muscle memory, because you've done it for so long. It kind of it would feel kind of foreign if it didn't inform your writing. So that actually does lead me into into the next part, because as a female writer, you're coming from your own experiences and you have your own voice when you're telling the story. What kind of perspectives do you as a female writer bring whenever you're developing a character and telling a story, either in plays or novels or in sketches?
Well, it's funny because, this has kind of changed over the years too, as far as, what dynamics between men and women were when I started writing in the 90s. versus what they are now, right? So I would say, starting out sketch wise and in my troupe, I've always been sort of tomboyish and like a guy's girl. So within that context, which is predominantly men, I was definitely one of the guys. But still bringing some of the women's perspective. Now I think things have definitely shifted, but I think that what works for me as a woman writer is probably, I think, that women sort of have a good ability to sort of investigate the whole playing field, especially the emotional playing field, and to really get into via whether it's empathy or just really trying to try on the shoes of the characters and the situation, like really be in it, and fully flush out like what everyone is feeling and thinking. But it also, my specific genre for novel writing is contemporary romance. So obviously that comes very much into play there. And there's a whole other, dynamic involved that I'm still trying to get right,
Yeah. I get that. I get that. So actually, that's a pretty good transition. So do you feel like there are certain genres that that female writers would excel more at than say others?
I would never limit, what I think women could excel in.
Okay. Yeah.
And partly like not I couldn't write everything, like I'm not gonna write an action based anything.
Mm-hmm.
I am not a screenwriter of action films. But I'm sure that there's a woman who's great at it, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know that, I don't think I would define specifically. I mean, like, obviously we are pretty good with romantic, oriented things. And there is definitely a really funny annual thing where they share segments of spicy things that guys have written in books that are really terrible. And I can't remember what it's called, but it's like one of the funniest things to read every year. So I think we do excel at that. But I think we're only limited by what anyone's experience is in. And now there's all kinds of, like, there's STEM romance and like I mean, there's crazy amounts of fantasy writers that are women, sci-fi, like all the things that people think predominantly are male. There are women killing it.
Yeah. I was just imagining like you just coming out one day and be like, guess what, guys? I wrote a Batman storyline. It's gonna be amazing, and you're gonna love it.
Okay, so here's the thing. I have like zero hot takes except for this one, and it's that I hate Batman. It's like the one thing I absolutely cannot stand. Like,
Really?
I'm a Marvel girl all the way. But
Okay.
yeah, Batman, it's so tedious and it's boring to me, and he's so tortured and it's so dark and everything is just so melodramatic to me. That's my only hot take.
It's like, yeah, it's like, it's like this rich guy here. He's working out his trauma by dressing up in a costume, beating up criminals.
That's what I'm saying. Like, but always like, why the voice? Like, why does it have to be so, I don't know. He takes himself too seriously, and I'm a comedian. I can't do that.
Yeah.
I also, I kind of have a beef with DC because I have an obsessive thing about Henry Cavill. Like, he's my everything. And like, I've tried to watch the Superman movies so many times and I just get really bored because they're just action,
Yeah.
I'm like, how can you bore me with a movie with Henry Cavill though? Like, I don't know.
Well, I was gonna say, like, if you had seen like the most recent Deadpool movie, you probably were like, over the moon with that brief. Oh, okay, never mind.
Oh no, I heard that he's got a great cameo.
Oh, well, I was gonna say, like,
or
if
or something.
yeah, it was a cameo. I was gonna say like, if they ever cast him, like, he'd be perfect as Wolverine if Hugh Jackman says to pack it in.
Well, I'm waiting for Highlander.
But yeah, with with writing, whether you're male or female, it's just so easy to kind of get lost in the weeds and kind of
Ugh.
just mess things up. And I know recently with with the DC movies, it's always been a huge miss, right? They haven't been able to tell the the proper story, because these characters are fascinating, really. I mean,
Yeah.
and I'll show my colors here. I'm a DC fanboy. I've grown up with
Okay.
DC.
Sorry, I shit on it.
No, I mean, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, I only got into Marvel, as recently as 2015, really.
Oh wow.
So, like, I had a lot of catching up to do. But
Yeah.
I feel like with DC, as well as like story writing in general, whether it's novels or films, it's just so easy to make write sensational literature, but in the process you lose the story, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk about that, kind of offer your take on why that's the case, and if there's any way to remedy that?
Tell me the question again.
So with movies and novels these days, they're very sensational, but there's no substance to it. The bit I guess from a literature standpoint, I guess one could look at the Twilight novels of Stephanie Meyers or 50 Shades of Grey. Like when you read them, it's all fluff. There's really nothing that you can get from it, apart from the fact that these are just a bunch of people who are surprisingly into sadomasochism. And then with film, and then with a lot of films, storyline kind of takes a back seat, because it's all about the visual effects. And we used to make fun of those movies a lot back in the day, especially with the Michael Bay movies. But especially now, when you watch these movies and TV shows, you get this feeling that that there's either no story, or the story is just so generic. You just you kind of wonder why do they just get some sort of monkey to sit down and write it, because it's very much copy and paste.
AI script, right?
Yeah. So I want to offer you, I want you to maybe talk about this and offer your take as a writer as to if there's any way that can be salvaged, or or if there's a sort of need for writers to kind of sit down and kind of figure out what are the basics of writing a good story before they actually attempt to put anything on screen or on stage, as it were.
I think hearing what you're outlining, the first thing that comes to mind, and this is all in a realm I think about a lot, because most of the art forms that I find myself in are really in more of the accessible and less of the artsy end of things.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think it kind of depends on what is your measure of success, right? Because nobody's going to tell Stephanie Meyer, or I can't remember her name, that wrote 50 Shades, E.L. James, like, you're not a success, because they'll be like, hey, look at my bank account, right?
Yeah, hold my beer. Yeah.
Right. I mean, people loved it. We also love McDonald's, right? Like, it's not a steak dinner, but it's delicious, right? So, and I say this as someone who read all of the Twilight novels and all of 50 Shades of Grey. But it's not going to be, Faulkner or Proust, right? Like, it's in its own place. It is successful. I think the thing as a writer, and it depends on what you're writing for, right? So for me right now, I'm writing books. I have to look at so I'm in the contemporary romance or rom-com genre. What is selling, right? And that's one of the things that's really hard as an artist to come around to, right? Because when you're young and you're in your 20s, you're like, I want to write what I'm passionate about. I want to write what inspires me. And it doesn't matter if it sells or not, right? Well, eventually, if you want to be a working artist, it does matter what sells. And you have to look at, what's out there and what people want. And the thing we always used to joke about in Second City days, I used to joke about, is I wanted to write, and I used to call it the scene everyone wants to see, right? And what is that thing? Like, what's that magical thing that is the series on Netflix that's like the Bridgerton, or the
It's like the
whatever
great.
the thing is.
It's like writers wanting to write the great American novel, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so whatever your genre is, you want to like hit it in that place. But how do you know what everybody wants, right? So you have to do this combination of, I think, looking at, okay, this is the market I'm in. This is what everybody wants. I have this idea that fits these things. It has these tropes, which are very popular or whatever. So I'm going to do the best I can at making that thing work. Currently, like the book that I have coming out this fall is the tropiest story that's already been told. Like, I mean, honestly, you've seen it before. There's a movie. It's like, woman gets an inn that is ramshackle and is going to redo it, and there's a hot guy next door. Like, everybody has heard this story before, but for some reason, it's been the piece that I've gotten the most. I've like won awards off of it, you know. So, so I don't think it's always about. I mean, I do think a hook is important, but I don't think it's about coming up with the world's freshest idea ever, right? I think voice has a lot, that does a lot of the work for you. People, so like people that are Lena Dunham fans or whoever the writer is, they're drawn to that voice, and whatever they come up with, they're still going to follow it because, you know, it speaks to them. So it's look at your market, you write what inspires you if it fits within that, and then, you know, just try to make it the best you can. Otherwise, you know, you're just grasping at straws, trying to get your 50 Shades money, but also be Proust, you know.
Right. And you know, in that sense, you really can't be both, right? I mean, you can't be E.L. James and Proust at the same time. You kind of have to be one or the other.
It's funny with those two examples, though. I'm sure you know this, but that 50 Shades was fanfic of Twilight.
Yeah,
That's how it came about. Yeah.
Exactly. But you know, but that's another interesting point too, because you know, because a lot of the movies and TV shows that we've seen, or a lot of the novels that we've read over the past 50 or so years, they're pretty much going back to what we were talking about earlier about re-improv. It's pretty much, you know, the same story that's been that we're familiar with, and then kind of repurposed. And to your point, you know, you're putting your spin, your own voice on it, but it's still the same story that we're familiar with. And it's almost and it's almost like just watching it, play out, and you're like, oh, I know what's going to happen here, but we're not so much interested in being able to predict what's going to happen next, because we've seen it 1,000 times. It's more of how will so and so react in this case, as opposed to previous iterations where writers have added their own spin on how this person would react in a similar situation.
Yeah. And I think we have in us a natural instinct of where stories are going to go or should go, right? When we're watching or reading or listening to or taking in media.
Yeah.
And then there's like this window of like what the reader or listener will bear, right? Where that's like, okay, that's fresh and I wasn't expecting it, so that's good. Or it went exactly where I thought it was going to go, but that was also satisfying. Or I totally saw that coming.
Yeah.
But if you go outside of that, they're like, absolutely, I do not believe that. 100%, no way would that have ever happened.
Yeah, you kind of tweak it just a little bit, that you make it your own, but it's not too, but it doesn't deviate too far from the from the story.
Yeah, to be fresh but not unbelievable.
Yeah, exactly. So I do want to talk about your work as a novelist, because I did an interview recently with a writer from California who writes novels and novellas, and he's also dabbled as a playwright as well.
Cool.
Can you talk about what the process is like for you when you're writing a novel? I know it's a very general question, but I kind of want to get your take on it.
Everybody approaches it differently, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Like I said, I'm a pantser, so my first draft will often be fairly quick. But right now I had written like 3 or 4 books, and then I would just go to the next one and start writing it. And hadn't gone back to, sort of hone and
Yeah, to
send
edit it.
the old ones. So I feel like I've been editing for a couple of years. But so, my approach, and it needs to improve, is usually like that aha moment. And for me, since I'm a romance writer, it's like a meet cute, but I'll have a scene in my head that's like, absolutely have to write that. And then you're like, oh crap, there's got to be like this whole rest of the book. But then I'll probably like jot down an outline and then completely not pay to it as a draft. And I have a critique partner that I work with, so we meet every couple of weeks and share chapters and help each other through both plotting and also like the work on the back end of like, line edit and stuff. And then since I'm self-pub, I will hire an editor to, polish it up before I put a cover on it and put it out myself.
So how long does it normally take for you to work on a draft? Is it just a few weeks or a month or what?
Yeah, I mean, my debut novel that came out this year called Humor Me was probably about a 6-week draft. And that was like in it. Like I was inspired and it went really smoothly. But
Right.
I would say I could normally, draft anywhere between 6 weeks to like 2 or 3 months, depending on how much time I have. Because of course I'm, full-time working elsewhere and writing in my free time. So
what about the editing process when you're going through and kind of figuring out this needs to go, maybe tweak this a little bit, maybe take this out and swap it for this line instead? How long is that process?
yeah. No, because I always equate it like being a pantser editing a book is like being a documentary filmmaker editing my film versus somebody who wrote, a narrative film and everything was planned out. So there's a lot of footage to go through, so to speak.
Yeah.
So my editing process is pretty long. The good news is I'm getting better at making bigger changes, and I'm constantly trying to learn, because I learned to writing 10-page sketches, and now I'm editing 90,000 word books, which is overwhelming. I sometimes can't really see the forest for the trees. I have a lot of respect for people who see structure really well, because that's not a strength for me. I'm definitely a seeing it close up kind of person.
Right. Just get it out there. Just pour it out onto the page.
Me editing reminds me of, I'm gonna out my husband on this. So, and I've seen other people talk about their male spouses specifically, like when you're like, let's clean the house. And like, while I'm like scrubbing the floors and cleaning the toilets and stuff, he'll be like reorganizing, I was going to say CDs, but we don't have those anymore. But you know what I mean? It looks like caught in the weeds on a really specific, not helpful thing. That's kind of me when I'm editing, because I'll be like, oh, you know what? That needs to be fixed. And it doesn't have anything to do with how smooth the plot is or anything like that. It's just like, oh, that is a shiny object.
It's like maybe instead of it being a house from the 1950s, it's a mock Tudor house. Ooh.
Yes, sir. Yes. Like, well, so my whole series is called Detroiters in Love, right? And then I realized that this book I'm editing right now, neither of the characters actually live in Detroit. So I had to change that. And then they were like, not really loving each other very much. I'm like, well, I better change that too. Like, you just.
It's like if James Joyce wrote Dubliners, but none of it was set in Dublin.
Right. And I was literally, and here's the thing, like Detroit doesn't play. You can't claim Detroit if you ain't it. So, so that was already going to get me shit. But then I had to, like, for a second I was thinking, well, maybe I'll write a forward saying, well, I'm named this series, but these couple of characters live in a suburb. No.
Yeah.
I had to change it. So I changed it. But and you got to thread it through,
Yeah, because I mean there'll always be these people who like look at it and they're like, yeah, BS. Yeah.
Exactly.
So So were you always interested in writing rom-coms, or was it just something that you kind of just fell into gradually?
It's funny. I started reading romance by accident because I was on like a trip for work and I had read the books I had with me, and I bought this book in the airport, and I was like, oh, there's a kidnapping and it's historical and Scottish. And then I was halfway home and like, oh my gosh, like fanning myself while I was reading it. So, but then that's when I started reading like a ton of this stuff. And then, there's a range of what's out there, right? And in the self-pub world, there are books that you will read that were like, did nobody even like check, like hit spell check? Like, there's stuff that, and so there's definitely like a learning curve. And you look and you're like, I'm a writer. I mean, I think I could do this, And so it was like, this is a medium that I really enjoy reading. I'm going to take my stab, right? And I don't know, it's changing to fiction from like theater and screenwriting was a big adjustment.
So what would you say was the biggest adjustment out of all of them? Really, was it the fact that these works were were not going to be performed like what you would have with sketch writing or playwriting?
It's two things. One, world building, because I just wrote dialogue. That's all I ever wrote, right?
Yeah.
And even stage direction, you sort of like eventually encouraged to write less and less of it and let the director handle that. But the other one was exactly like you said, people reading it like away from you. Like if I was in a show or wrote it, I could sit in the audience and be like, they liked it or they hate it because it's happening right now and they're reacting or they're not. Right. But when those 1-star reviews come through and somebody had read it, in their own home, and everybody feels differently, and they're not affected by the people around them, like in a theater, like honest to God, like sometimes you could probably have a show in front of somebody who probably wouldn't have liked it, but if the energy in the house is great, it might make them feel like they had a great experience, so who knows?
Yeah. But, well, another thing I want to bring up too is because when you're writing plays or when you're writing sketches, your work is very brief, right? It's not.
Yeah.
You're maybe doing maybe 1 or 2 acts on any given time, but but for the most part, it's going to end probably within within like 5 or 6 pages. I mean. What was it a challenge to kind of sit there and trying to like you said kind of create like a world environment for your characters, but was it also difficult to kind of just make it a long book, as it were, kind of stretching it out further and further, because I've been in that position before. I've sat there, I'm like, I don't know what else I can add to that. Like I think 60 I think 25,000 words is all right, but it's like, no, like
for a novella.
Yeah. But so talk about that, because I can't imagine like at the very beginning that was easy for you.
Honestly, I had the opposite problem, and I still have the opposite problem. My initial drafts are long. They're long. Like everything in the kitchen sink. The first book that I wrote that no one will ever see, the first draft was 140,000 words, and it was not like fantasy. It was a romantic, like contemporary romance. So, but I also didn't know what the industry standard was either. I was just like, I'm gonna sit down and write a book, So, now I know a little bit more of what the market will bear, but I still come out. I mean, most of my first drafts are about 100,000 words still, and then I got to get the scalpel out,
Right. So what would you say was the most important lesson that you learned when when writing novels? Now that now that you've kind of developed your own voice and you feel comfortable with the characters that you created and the world that they live in, like what have you learned in that time period?
The thing that I'm kind of obsessive about, and I don't know that I'll ever get right, but it's really fascinating to me. both in theater and in fiction, there is a show don't tell rule, right?
Yeah.
Or guideline, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's different in either of those mediums. If I'm writing a play and they say show don't tell, that basically means like don't throw it all in the dialogue, like have some physical things happening on the stage or have some emotion happening on the stage that isn't dialogue. That's not necessarily the case in fiction. And it really threw me off. I was in a critique group and they're like, well, show don't tell. So like put it in, like have her say it. And I was like, that's the opposite of show don't. Like, but what they were really saying, like deep POV has been fascinating and difficult to master as a fiction writer, to be like really within the head of that character, to get rid of all the filter stuff of like she looked and saw and realized and like that space between the person and what's happening, and just have it be happening. Like that's the thing I feel like I'm constantly relearning every time I write something.
And that's what I find so fascinating, is the fact that that they're using the same terms, but they've got different definitions.
Yeah.
I think the biggest challenge for me is the fact that you never know if you're doing it right. You know what I mean? And I don't know if I don't know if you've had the same problem as well. But when you try to do that show don't tell, you're not entirely sure if you've done it right. And you're not entirely sure if the reader is going to get what you're trying to say.
Yes. Yeah, because I can see it really clearly in my head.
Yeah.
And I'm just trying to describe it to you, but you might not see it the way I see it.
Yeah, and then someone reads it and they come up with a different conclusion. You just want to be like, how the hell did you get that? But then,
oh my goodness, yes.
But then
absolutely.
At the same time, it's kind of like, well, they came to that conclusion because you kind of, you're kind of playing around with the words to where that's what they're going. Well, that's another thing too, because I remember it was either a class or a workshop a few years ago, and they were saying, and they were talking about what you were saying about show don't tell, and they were saying, you've got to, you kind of have to word it in a way that to you is going to be quite obvious. You're going to know exactly where it's going, but for the reader, it's pretty vague and ambiguous. So obviously, let's say if Joe Smith read your novel, just the way that you kind of worded the scene, they might come up with a different conclusion than say Anna Smith, who reads the same thing but comes up with something different. Have you heard anything like that on your end? Or?
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I think that this is really why all these layers of other people reading your work are so important. Like critique partners, critique groups, beta readers, ARC readers, like getting all of that feedback, because it's such a like solitary art form. And that was the other big shift, is like, I went from theater, which is the ultimate like collaborative, group work thing, to I'm gonna be by myself and write it all alone and no one will see it till it's done. Yeah. And that can be really, I mean, even if, because I have done a lot of 2-man, sketch shows before, and, it's working when both of you are excited and you're making each other laugh, or, like really like, yeah. When you do that alone, there's like what do they call it? Like you're reinforcing your own, you're like in an echo chamber, confirmation bias. So you're like, oh, that was brilliant, but you don't know until somebody else reads it. Actually, my the thing I always go to when I think like I've written something and it's brilliant, I always think of that scene from Christmas Story when the teacher's reading his theme and it's his dream and she's like, A plus. I always think of that for my own stuff.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's kind of like that kid is like, oh, I've got this great thing I've always wanted, and then everyone's like, yeah, you'll shoot your eye out, kid. I'm like,
right,
come
with
on.
a compass and the stock and this thing that tells time, A plus. Yeah,
It's And I think that's kind of inherent in, in all of, in anybody who writes, whether it's short stories, plays, or novels. It's this idea that what we're doing is going to be the next big work that's going to be part of, the Western canon. And people will will read it for, for generations, and
Yes.
when they want to learn about the human condition or what it means to fall in love, they'll read, a Margaret Edwartowski, because
Mhm.
because it just encapsulates what it means to be a human being. But
Yeah.
but obviously, we always have to do a reality check. I know I had, because because when I've submitted work to literary agents, I've always gotten a response back. And I told this to Matthew when we did our interview. But I remember getting the first letter, seeing the email response after a few weeks, and I was like, oh boy, like, I bet they were impressed with it. And then
This is it.
yeah, and they're like,
Yeah.
I'm like, and I even had it planned. I was going to like march into my boss's office and be like, so long, bitches. But then,
Right.
like, I read it and they're like, dear Mr. Suwant, thank you for your interest, but upon review, we find that your work is not compatible with what we are looking for. And I'm like, shit.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not calling out of work. Like,
Yeah.
after that.
Yeah, I used to going into querying and stuff. I used to think, well, I'm an actor. I've heard no, a billion times, and a lot of times it's like they look you over and say no. That is in a lot of ways worse than we read your manuscript, we don't like it. But nothing prepares you. I mean, you just have, and then eventually like, oh, they said no too. Like, oh, that was a no. Well, I still have a few out there. It is what it is.
I mean, let me ask you this, because you mentioned earlier that you self-publish your works. Do you find that do you find that arena a lot more? What's the best word I want to use? I guess, would you say is a lot more liberating than having to go through the traditional route of trying to find an agent, or trying to, like, shop it around to different publishers and see if they if they would like to publish your work and market it?
It's the industry has changed so much, and I think one thing first, a real advantage in my genre is that romance is like a hugely successful portion of publishing, and it's like the most readers read this stuff. But the thing about them is they eat books, like they just go through them super fast. And so having as much content available is really kind of their jam. And self-publishing, I mean, romance was really sort of the like trailblazer with self-publishing, because the readership is like there. So some of those old you're just self-publishing or vanity publishing attitudes are a little bit more by the wayside now, which is nice. But for me, I was querying. I came to this stuff as a second or third artistic career, right? So I don't have like decades to find an agent. And it is a very slow process. And it also, like, odds wise, is like any other creative industry, is like buying a lottery ticket. I mean, obviously you put a lot of work behind the lottery ticket.
Yeah.
But there's no guarantee that you're going to get an agent. So I just kind of got like impatient with having my stuff out in the world, or having I had 7 or 8 books finished, written, that weren't, doing anything. And so I had other great people in my writers organization who were self-published, and they were really forthcoming with, a lot of the info. And nowadays, like, you get Atticus or Vellum, right? One of the formatting softwares. You get a decent cover designer and a decent editor. It's not free necessarily, but you can, you can kind of figure it out, and you can learn this stuff very easily. Even, Gen Xer like me can learn this stuff. And then after that, it's all just social media and marketing.
Yeah.
Which is its own,
Yeah, it's a whole new arena right there.
Right.
It's like,
but I was just like, got on TikTok, like, we'll see, like, whatever.
So So would you say that for a young writer who's like up and coming, and they kind of feel daunted, they feel like the traditional way of trying to get a book published isn't working for them? Would you say like self-publishing is like the next best thing, or
It's a
or would
totally viable option. Yes.
yeah, I mean, do you think? Do you think it's still worth trying to go the traditional route of trying to get an
Oh
agent?
yeah, for sure. I mean, I'm
Okay.
still trying to get it, like, Berkeley has their unagented submissions. Of course, I'm going to send it, I'm going to send stuff wherever I can always.
Right.
Because, why ever stop trying? Like, and hybrid is a totally legitimate thing that people do, or people, put whole series out self-pub, and then the right next book hits an agent and they love it and they pick them up, and then that's the next step of their career. Like, there's no reason to stop submitting. You can't, I say the same, I write grants in my day job, and I say the same thing is like, you cannot win the lottery if you don't buy a ticket. So send your shit out. And the other thing I think that a lot of young writers, I know I wasn't young, but I was new, had trouble with is that naked feeling of sending your baby out into the world to someone. Like, obviously you want to be in the right channels, right? Like submitting to agents or in legitimate contests or things that you don't want to just send your book to anyone. But getting past that thing, like, oh God, they're gonna read it, like, yeah, they're gonna read it. Get it in front of as many people as you can,
Yeah, exactly. Because because they're not going to know what your work is about if you don't show them what it's about, really.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of when I was in undergrad. The first costume fitting I had in the costume shop at the college, they gave me like a costume, and there was a little room you could go into and change. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go in there. And this grad student costumer was like, I mean, you can, but I mean, after you do shows for a while, you're not going to need that. You could just do it right here.
Yeah.
And at the time I was young and I was like, how dare she? That was so mean and blah, blah, blah. But then, of course, cut to 15, 20 years later, I was like, can I just just change your clothes in front of anybody? You don't care, So it's the same thing with your writing. It's like, I'm only going to show this to my best friend. And then, down the road, you're like, oh, you want to read it? Yeah, cool. Like, here you go.
Yeah, you kind of have to. It's almost like you just gotta escape out of the echo chamber because because you can get as much praise from everybody that but if these people aren't going to get you to where you need to be, then it's empty calories. So to speak.
You got to build calluses when you learn to play the guitar. And you need to have people tell you, like, no, you're not amazing, or you're not as amazing as you think you are. You have some gifts, and here's where it could be better.
Yeah.
I mean, to hear it too.
Yeah, I mean that's why writers need editors, because otherwise everybody would just publish something they think is amazing, but then people look at it and it's like, oh, this is just complete and utter dreck right there.
Yeah.
Well, Margaret, I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your day to be on this to be on this episode. Yeah, I actually learned a lot. When it comes to writing. If people want to learn more about your work, or if they want to check out your book, where can they go?
So my pen name is Maggie Elliott, Eliot, just one L and one T. And my website is just www.maggieelliott.com. And so my books are on there. And I'm also on TikTok under author Maggie Elliott. I'm on Instagram under author Maggie Elliott, Facebook. I just started a Threads. Like, I'm the social media. I get around on social media. Let's put it that way.
Now, just out of curiosity, why did you choose Maggie Elliott?
Well, I saw a thing that said choose a pen name that is close enough to your own that you would answer to it. So I have been called Maggie by people before, so that was easy. And then I wrote years ago a jukebox musical about Cass Elliott, Mama Cass, and played her. So that was sort of a nod to her.
Gotcha. That's what I always found so fascinating is that writers sometimes they kind of have like a nom de plume, as it were, to kind of create like a separate identity, and I think it's just part of the whole idea of creating characters that that you kind of develop a reflex for it. So it's like, if I can develop characters for all these other people, why don't I develop one for myself?
Well, there's a couple, like, first of all, Edwartowski doesn't really, like, you don't see that on a lot of book covers. You know what I mean? Like, it's not a real sellable name.
That's what I was gonna say. Like, it's a very unique name. Like, why not run with it? You know.
But then the other thing is, you know, my books have a little bit of spice, and my day job is in the nonprofit sector working with youth. So I really don't want to have those overlap much. So.
Well, I was just imagining, like, as you said that, was like, you know, Maggie Elliott, you know, went to, you know, grew up in, you know, the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and she went to Columbia, but she developed a love for writing. She dropped out her sophomore year to devote herself to writing, and she currently lives in an island off the coast of Michigan, not far from Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
You know,
island near Ann Arbor. That would be amazing.
I was gonna say, like, that. No, I would love to see you, like, just write a whole, like, fake autobiography.
Fake stuff. I know. Well, and that's the weird thing, you know, when you're established as an artist in your community under a name, and then you take on a pen name, and then, you know, like, you know, even today I was like, well, I mean, you know me as, you know, this actor performer who also writes books.
Yeah.
You know, so which am I? Who am I today?
I know.
I'm my authentic self for you.
Like I said, if you do write, like, a fake autobiography of Maggie Elliott, I would love to read it.
Okay.
I'm just, because now I just can't get it out of my head that
writing prompt, right?
It's like, I can't get out of my head now that Maggie Elliott, you know, was an Ivy Leaguer who decided, this is not for me.
Who worked with the Peace Corps for 3 years, right?
It's like she developed her love for the romance novels, you know, during a trip to Bulgaria, where she managed to find a nearly ruined copy of Lancelot and Guinevere, and that sort of launched her into the process
Lady
of writing.
Chatterley's lover, right?
Exactly. It's like after a semester at Oxford, she made a pilgrimage to D.H. Lawrence's house, where she developed an affinity for Lady Chatterley's lover.
Yeah, and for the huntsman, or what, a gameskeeper or whatever, right? Yeah.
You got to write it now, Margaret, because I really want to read it now.
The queue is pretty long. The terrible thing is I'm in the editing trenches for a couple of books, because I have one coming out hopefully November and then January. Mm-hmm. But I have all of these, they call them plot bunnies, but I have all of these things that I'm, like, just burning up wanting to write. But it's like my dad didn't let us open the new bag of chips till we finished the old one. You know what I'm saying? Like, I gotta finish these projects first. Yeah. So no Maggie Elliott book until 2026 probably.
Well, I'll be on the lookout for it, because I'm just dying to see what sort of backstory kind of led Maggie Elliott to write rom-coms. But I just want to thank you for taking time to be on this podcast. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time of watching. And and if you're enjoying it, please remember to drop a like and subscribe. And as always, get you on the next one.